Hi guys, sorry I'm not in today, but I wanted to still give you this lesson. It's pretty easy, it's a lot of terms. We're looking at angle pairs today, so it all has to do about two angles and their relationship together. So I'm just going to walk you through the terms, try and explain them, and then there's some examples at the end that I'm going to talk through. So adjacent angles, when you look at the word adjacent, if you think about what that means in English, it means next to. So adjacent angles, what we want to think of is there are two angles next to each other. What it means is you have two angles that have a common side and a common vertex, but there's no common interior points. So if I trace angle 1 and I trace angle 2, what you're going to notice is they have one shared side there where they come together. They're like next door neighbors. That's what makes them adjacent. So angle 1, angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent. The next term is a really, really important term. These are going to come up all throughout the rest of geometry is vertical angles. Vertical angles is when you have two angles whose sides form opposite rays. So that's kind of a confusing definition right now, but what vertical means is you're going to have two angles that form opposite V's. That's my shortcut definition of it. So if I trace off here angle 3, and then I trace angle 4, what you're going to notice is there are two V's that go in opposite directions. So angle 3 and angle 4 are vertical. And then this is a point, if I were in class today, I was going to do a activity with you, and I was going to have you draw those on a piece of paper and try and fold them together, and what you notice is that angle 4 will fold on top of angle 3, so they end up being congruent. So that's a really, really big note, and we'll talk about this in the examples later. Vertical angles are congruent. Super important note there. Alright, so let's look at another pair of angles. So here's our next pair. These ones you may have seen at some point before, but it's called complementary angles. Complementary angles are two angles whose sum is 90 degrees. So when you look at the first picture and we look at angle 1 and angle 2, they together make this right angle, and we know that's 90 degrees. So angle 1 and angle 2 are complementary. And then when you look at the second picture, the difference is they're not joined together, but they don't have to be. If you add 40 plus 50, you get 90. So angle A and angle B are complementary. And then the next one says supplementary. Supplementary is two angles whose sum is 180 degrees. So it has to do with when you put the two together. These are still pairs, so it has to do with two angles together. When you put the two angles together, they're 180 degrees. So when you look at this first example here, if I were to draw a straight line across the bottom, you're going to notice that these make, when we have a straight angle, if you remember straight angle from earlier this week, it's 180 degrees. So that means that angle 3 and angle 4 are supplementary. And then when you look at the next pair of angles, if I add those together, 130 plus 150 is 180. Angle P and angle Q are also supplementary. So it just has to do with the two angles when you put them together, they make 180, but you have to remember it's them together. Alright, then we have one more angle pair, and then we're going to do some example problems. The last pair of angles is called a linear pair. It's when you have two adjacent angles whose non-common side form opposite rays. So they're talking about this side on the bottom here. If I were to look at the two rays that are put together on the bottom, one goes one way, one goes the other way. When it forms opposite rays, what really does, if you look at the word linear pair, is it makes a line. So for linear pair, I think two angles that make a line. And if they make a line, we kind of just saw this on the last example, a line is really 180 degrees. So we're going to know for a linear pair, this is the other really big thing for today, a linear pair is going to equal 180 degrees. So in this picture, the measure of angle 5 plus the measure of angle 6 is going to come to a total of 180 degrees because they make a straight line together. So that's our other really big thing for today. So linear pair is 180 degrees, and then the other one was vertical angles earlier. Vertical angles are congruent. So now we're going to do some examples just to talk through all the terms and make sure that I didn't talk too quickly here. So looking at the first example here, we want to know if angle 3 and angle 4 are adjacent. So first thing, I'm going to kind of highlight those. If it helps when you're doing this on your homework, if you kind of ignore the rest of the stuff, cover it up with your hand, pretend like that stuff's not there for a minute, and just look at those two. It says that those two angles are adjacent, which is in fact a true statement because adjacent, remember, means next to each other. So since they're next to each other, sharing just the line, they don't overlap at all, those are considered adjacent. Alright, next example. 6 and 3 are vertical. So if I find those, and you ignore everything else here, if I kind of just cross it off for a minute, pretend like this stuff's not there, and I just look at those two angles. Those two angles are across from each other, but if you notice, they're not the same size, and they should really make an X when they come together. It should be V's that come together and the lines match up, and these bottom two lines here don't match up, so this is false. They have to be directly across from each other. You should be able to fold them on top of each other. Alright, next example, 5 and 6. Five and 6 are a linear pair. So again, I'm going to cross the rest of this off and try and look at just 5 and 6. When I look at those, and I look at the outside line here, remember a linear pair, keyword is line in there. They're supposed to make a straight line on the outside. These do not, so this is false. Number 4, 2 and 6 are vertical. 2 and 6. Cross the rest of this stuff off here. Ignore it. Pretend it's not even there. When I look at those, here's the difference. I can make this X here, and I have the two V's that are across from each other, and I can fold them on top of each other. This is true. So at this point in the lesson, I would have asked you to try the rest of these on your own. So if you want to pause the video for a minute and just jot down your answers somewhere, and then come back and check and see if you got them right. So I'm giving you like 3 more seconds to hit the pause button. Then I'm going to start talking through number 5. Alright, so if I look at 1 and 5, they're asking if those are adjacent. You have to remember that term means that they're next to each other. So when I trace 1 and 5 here, if I cross off the rest, kind of cover it up with your hand when you're doing your homework, those are not next to each other. Those are actually across from each other, so this is going to be false. Number 6. Angle 1 and angle 6 are a linear pair, so I need to look at those. Linear pair, keyword there is line. I'm looking to see if when I trace those, and kind of ignore everything else, if I cover up the rest of them, if they make a line, and there is in fact a line right here at the bottom. Excuse me. So this is true. They're a linear pair. And then the last ones deal with the other two terms we talked about today. So if you paused it and seen how well you paid attention to those two terms. So we have 4 and 5. Those are supposed to be complementary. Remember complementary, if you're having a hard time remembering, think alphabetically. Complementary comes before supplementary. Complementary means 90 degrees, because 90 comes first. Supplementary means 180. It's a real easy way to keep them straight. So this, because of that right angle box right here, is a true statement, because together they're making 90 degrees. And then the last example says that angle 2 and angle 3 are supplementary. So when we look at those and you kind of ignore everything else, if they're supplementary, they should be 180, which means right now, because they're next to each other, they should be making a straight line, and they don't. So this is a false statement. Those are actually complementary right now. They make 90-degree angle. Alright, let's try some more.